History has a way of keeping its deepest secrets locked away, even from the most determined investigators. Some of the most famous figures who ever walked the earth met ends so mysterious, so baffling, that even centuries later, we're still piecing together the fragments of their final moments. These aren't just stories, they're enigmas wrapped in riddles, whispered about in hushed tones by historians, scientists, and amateur sleuths alike. What if some of the greatest deaths in history weren't as straightforward as the textbooks claim? What if the truth has been hiding in plain sight all along? Think about the last time you heard a story that sent chills down your spine, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow lurking just out of sight. Now imagine that feeling, but rooted in real events, real lives cut short under circumstances so strange they defy logic. From emperors and artists to scientists and revolutionaries, the world's most iconic figures have left behind trails of unanswered questions. Was it murder disguised as illness, a conspiracy buried under layers of time, or something even more unsettling? This is where the past becomes a puzzle waiting to be solved. Over the course of this video, we'll uncover 30 of history's most haunting death mysteries cases that have baffled experts for generations. Some names you'll recognize instantly, others might surprise you. But one thing ties them all together, the eerie sense that we still don't have the full story. So settle in, because what you're about to hear isn't just a list of facts, it's a journey into the unknown, where every clue leads to another question, and even the most accepted theories might not hold up under scrutiny. The truth is out there, hidden in the shadows of history, and it's time to bring it into the light. Alexander the Great was at the height of his power when death came for him with unsettling swiftness. Just 32 years old, the conqueror who had built an empire stretching from Greece to India was suddenly struck by a mysterious illness in Babylon. The accounts of his final days are clouded in contradictions. Some say he burned with fever for 12 agonizing nights. Others claim he was gripped by excruciating pain after a night of heavy drinking. What we do know is this: within 2 weeks, the man who had reshaped the ancient world was gone. But was it really illness that killed him? Suspicion swirls around those last days like a gathering storm. Some ancient historians point to poison slipped into his wine by one of his own generals. Names like Cassander and Antipater emerge from the shadows, rivals who stood to gain everything if Alexander fell. Even his wife, Roxana, wasn't above suspicion. The missing will only deepens the intrigue. Alexander was a meticulous planner, yet no clear succession plan surfaced after his death. Was it destroyed, hidden, or did he never have the chance to name an heir because someone made sure he wouldn't? Then there's the matter of his body. A king like Alexander should have been laid to rest with grandeur, but his corpse became a political pawn. His general Ptolemy hijacked the funeral procession, diverting it to Egypt, where it vanished into legend. Some say he was buried in Alexandria, others whisper his tomb was lost to time, or worse, deliberately concealed. The lack of a grave feels like history's final taunt, a missing piece in a puzzle that refuses to be solved. What really happened in Babylon that summer? Natural causes, a carefully plotted assassination, or something even more unexpected? The truth may never fully surface, but one thing is certain: Alexander's death was as enigmatic as his life, a final conquest that still slips through our fingers. Julius Caesar's final day reads like a script from a tragic play, one where every warning was ignored, every omen dismissed until it was too late. The Ides of March, that fateful 15th day, had been whispered in his ear for weeks. A soothsayer's chilling prophecy, his wife Calpurnia's nightmares of blood-stained statues. Even the gods seemed to be shouting for him to stay away from the Senate. But Caesar, ever the defiant ruler, brushed them aside. What followed wasn't just an assassination, it was a spectacle of betrayal so brutal it still shocks us 2,000 years later. 23 stab wounds, That's the number history remembers, each blade wielded by men who had once bowed to him, laughed with him, even called him friend. The sheer violence of it raises unsettling questions. Why so many strikes? Was it sheer panic, or something more calculated, a deliberate act of overkill to send a message? Among the conspirators, names like Brutus and Cassius stand out, their motives wrapped in lofty rhetoric about saving the Republic. But dig deeper, and their alliance crumbles into contradictions. Many were deeply in debt, their fortunes tied to Caesar's reforms. Others feared losing influence in a Rome where one man held near absolute power. So was this really about principle or personal survival? Then there's the mystery of Caesar's last words. Shakespeare immortalized the Latin phrase, et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus. But ancient historians like Suetonius claim he died in silence, pulling his toga over his face in grim resignation. The truth may never be settled, but that debate itself speaks volumes. A man who spent his life scripting his own legend left behind a death scene even historians can't agree on. But perhaps the most haunting detail isn't the daggers or the prophecies, it's what came after. Far from restoring the Republic, Caesar's murder unleashed chaos, paving the way for the very tyranny the conspirators claimed to oppose. Their knives didn't save Rome, they doomed it, and in that tragic irony lies history's quiet verdict. Sometimes the noblest intentions hide the darkest consequences. Hatshepsut's reign should have been immortalized in gold and stone after all. She was one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, a ruler who transformed her kingdom into a thriving empire through trade and monumental building projects. Yet for centuries, her name was conspicuously absent from the temples and tombs where she once loomed larger than life. Her images were chiseled away, her titles scraped from monuments, her very existence nearly wiped from history. This wasn't just neglect, it was a deliberate campaign to erase her. But who would go to such lengths and why? The answer may lie in the shadows of her own family. Hatshepsut initially ruled as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, but she soon took the unprecedented step of declaring herself full pharaoh, adopting the titles and even the false beard reserved for kings. For 2 decades, she governed with unmatched skill until her death, when Thutmose finally ascended to power. Then the purge began. Historians long assumed his resentment drove the destruction, a son lashing out at the woman who had sidelined him. But the truth might be more complicated. Some scholars argue the erasure began decades after Hatshepsut's death, suggesting political motives rather than personal vendettas. Was Thutmose rewriting history to strengthen his own lineage, or was someone else behind the chisels that scraped her face from the walls? The mystery deepened in 2007 when a single tooth cracked the case wide open. Archaeologists used DNA testing to identify a long-neglected mummy as Hatshepsut herself, found humbly placed in a lesser tomb rather than the grand burial she deserved. The discovery revealed more than her remains, it exposed the fragility of legacy. Even a ruler as powerful as Hatshepsut could vanish, her story rewritten by those who came after. But here's the twist, the very act of erasure preserved her. The targeted destruction left telltale gaps in the stone, ghostly outlines where her image once stood, ensuring she would never be truly forgotten. Perhaps the greatest irony is that Thutmose's attempts to obliterate her only magnified her intrigue. Today, Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari stands as a testament not just to her reign, but to the futility of trying to silence history. The stones whisper her name louder than ever, a queen who refused to stay erased. Edgar Allan Poe's death reads like one of his own macabre tales, a chilling final chapter shrouded in fog and unanswered questions. It began with his sudden disappearance in early October 1849, just days after leaving Richmond, Virginia, where he'd been visiting his fiancée. 5 agonizing days later, he was found in a Baltimore tavern, delirious and dressed in clothes that weren't his, tattered, ill-fitting garments that bore no resemblance to the refined wardrobe Poe was known for. He couldn't explain where he'd been or how he'd gotten there. The only clue came in the feverish whispers of a name, Reynolds. Then, within hours, the master of mystery was gone. Theories about those missing days spiral in every direction. Some point to Poe's history of alcoholism, suggesting he fell victim to a days-long bender, but his fiancée insisted he'd sworn off drinking months earlier. Others propose he was drugged and forced to vote repeatedly in a rigged election, a grim practice known as cooping, where victims were shuttled between polling places in altered states. Yet medical records from his final hours describe symptoms that don't quite fit: hallucinations, tremors, and an erratic pulse. This has led modern scholars to speculate about rabies, noting that Poe showed no signs of hydrophobia, the classic symptom, but displayed other telltale markers of the disease. Then there's the enigma of Reynolds. Was it a person, a code? Poe had mentioned a Mr. Reynolds in a letter years earlier, an obscure figure linked to polar exploration. Could it have been a delusion sparked by fever? Or was it a clue to something darker, like the political kidnappings that plagued Baltimore at the time? Even the location of Poe's grave adds another layer of mystery. Originally buried in an unmarked plot, his body was later moved, but rumors persist that the wrong remains were exhumed, leaving his final resting place as uncertain as his death. What makes Poe's end so haunting isn't just the lack of answers, it's the eerie symmetry. A man who spent his life weaving tales of the grotesque and unexplained met a fate stranger than fiction. His death, like his stories, lingers in the shadows, refusing to surrender its secrets. King Tutankhamun's golden mask might be the most recognizable artifact of ancient Egypt, but behind that serene gold face lies a death steeped in violence and political intrigue. For decades, the boy king was thought to have died from a simple accident until modern technology peeled back the layers of his mummy and revealed something far more sinister. CT scans conducted in 2005 showed a badly fractured left leg with evidence of infection raging through the bone. Combine that with traces of malaria found in his system, and you've got a recipe for a slow, agonizing end. But here's the chilling twist: the fracture wasn't clean. The break suggested a high-impact injury, the kind that could have been caused by a blow or a violent fall. So was it really an accident, or was the young pharaoh pushed? The spotlight turns to two powerful men who stood to gain everything from Tut's demise. His elderly advisor, swiftly married Tut's widow Ankhesenamun and claimed the throne, an unusually hasty succession that reeks of opportunism. Then there's Horemheb, the ambitious general who eventually erased both Tut and I from official records, chiseling their names from monuments as if they'd never ruled at all. The timing is suspicious. Tut died just as he was reaching an age where he could have asserted real power. Did I, the seasoned politician, see a threat in the young king's growing independence? Or did Horemheb, the military strategist, orchestrate a coup to clear his own path to the throne? And then, of course, there's the so-called curse of the pharaohs. When Howard Carter's team opened Tut's tomb in 1922, a string of untimely deaths followed: financier Lord Carnarvon succumbing to an infected mosquito bite, others perishing in mysterious accidents. Newspapers spun tales of ancient vengeance, but science tells a different story. Mold spores lurking in the sealed tomb, toxic levels of ammonia and formaldehyde from burial chemicals, these were the real killers. Yet the legend endures, a shadow clinging to Tut's story like the wrappings of his mummy. What truly happened in those shadowed palace corridors 3,000 years ago? The fractures, the fever, the fingerprints of power-hungry men, it all points to a throne drenched in blood. Tut's golden treasures might have survived the ages, but the truth of his death remains buried, waiting for the next clue to shake loose from the sands of time. Marie Antoinette's final months were a slow unraveling of dignity, each day stripping away another layer of the queen she once was. By the time she reached the conciergerie prison, the woman who had dazzled Versailles with powdered wigs and silk gowns was reduced to a shadow, her famous chestnut hair shockingly white. Legend claims this transformation happened overnight, though historians suggest the stress of captivity likely bleached it over weeks. What's undeniable is the psychological torture she endured, separated from her surviving son, forced to listen to the screams of other prisoners, and subjected to a mock trial where prosecutors spun wild accusations of incest and treason. The verdict was never in doubt. The morning of her execution, October 16, 1793, began with a grotesque oversight. As Marie Antoinette mounted the scaffold, the executioner discovered the guillotine's blade hadn't been properly secured. For 12 agonizing minutes, she stood bound before a jeering crowd while workers fumbled with ropes and machinery. When the blade finally fell, witnesses reported her lips moving, not the fabricated, "let them eat cake," a phrase she never uttered, but likely a prayer or a final whisper to the children she'd never see again. Even in death, she was denied peace. Her body was dumped into an unmarked grave near the Madeleine Cemetery, covered in quicklime to hasten decay. During the restoration, attempts to locate her remains for proper burial turned up only fragments, a jawbone, a garter, amid the jumbled bones of other victims. The most haunting relic, a lock of that white hair, snipped by a sympathizer before her execution, now preserved like a relic. The myth of her callousness, the infamous cake remark, was propaganda, a lie crafted by revolutionaries to paint her as out of touch. In truth, she'd quietly donated to famine relief efforts, but revolutions need villains, and Marie Antoinette's fate was sealed long before the blade dropped. Her story isn't just about a queen's fall, it's about how history rewrites the dead to fit the needs of the living. And in that rewriting, the real woman, the grieving mother, the humiliated prisoner, was lost all over again. The night Grigory Rasputin died was steeped in the kind of grotesque violence that blurs the line between history and legend. Invited to the opulent Yusupov Palace on December 30, 1916, the so-called Mad Monk walked straight into a trap laid by aristocrats desperate to rid Russia of his influence over the royal family. The first attempt came in the form of cyanide-laced cakes and wine, enough poison, it was said, to kill 5 men. Yet Rasputin ate and drank with no visible effect. Some claim the poison was inert, others that his notorious tolerance for alcohol somehow neutralized it. But the conspirators, growing increasingly frantic, resorted to more direct measures. A single gunshot rang out as Prince Felix Yusupov fired point-blank into Rasputin's chest. The monk crumpled, only to rise again hours later, lunging at his assailants with superhuman fury. More shots followed, 3, 4, some accounts say even 6, before his battered body was bound in a curtain and hurled into the icy Neva River. When fishermen found him days later, the autopsy revealed lungs filled with water. He'd still been alive when he hit the river. The most chilling detail, though, wasn't the failed poison or the bullets. It was his heart. Removed during the autopsy and preserved in a jar, the organ showed no signs of the cyanide that should have stopped it instantly. To some, this was proof of Rasputin's supposed mystical invulnerability. To skeptics, it hinted at a botched assassination or even a deliberate hoax. Whispers of British involvement add another layer of intrigue. Historians have uncovered memos suggesting MI6 agents in Petrograd may have encouraged the plot, fearing Rasputin's influence would pull Russia out of World War I. Files remain classified to this day, leaving us to wonder, was this a royal conspiracy, a foreign operation, or something even darker? Rasputin's death wasn't just an end, it was the spark that lit the fuse of revolution, leaving a nation to wonder if killing the unkillable man had doomed them all. Ambrose Bierce rode into Mexico in 1913 with the dry wit and sharp pen that had made him famous and vanished without a trace. The 71-year-old journalist, known for his blistering satires and cynical short stories, had spent decades skewering American politics and culture. But as the Mexican Revolution raged, something drew him south. His last known letter, dated December 26, 1913, sent from Chihuahua, carried an eerie finality. If you hear of my being stood up against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think it's a pretty good way to depart this life." Then silence. Theories about his fate spiral like dust devils across the desert. Some say he joined Pancho Villa's rebel forces, perhaps as an observer or even an advisor. Bierce had covered wars before, and Villa was known to court foreign journalists. Others whisper he was executed by federal troops, his body left in an unmarked grave. A more outlandish claim suggests he faked his own death, slipping into obscurity to escape his troubled past, including the suicides of 2 of his children. But the most haunting possibility, that his famously caustic tongue finally caught up with him. Bierce had never been one to mince words, even in hostile territory. Did a careless remark about the wrong revolutionary leader seal his fate? Villa himself adds fuel to the fire. Years later, the revolutionary general allegedly told a reporter that Bierce had been captured and shot by his own men, but no records confirm it. Even the location of his disappearance shifts depending on the account. Some place him near the siege of Ojinaga, others deep in the Sierra Madre. The lack of a body, a grave, or any definitive witness leaves the mystery maddeningly open. What makes Bierce's vanishing so compelling isn't just the unanswered questions, it's the grim poetry of it. A man who wrote so vividly about death, who once defined alone in his Devil's Dictionary as in bad company, may have met an end as darkly fitting as his fiction. The revolution swallowed him whole, leaving behind only rumors and that chilling last letter, a final twist from a writer who knew exactly how stories should end. The death of Socrates wasn't just an execution, it was a meticulously documented descent into darkness, a chilling intersection of philosophy and physiology. Plato's Phaedo paints the scene with haunting clarity. The 70-year-old philosopher, condemned by Athens for corrupting the youth, calmly drinking a cup of hemlock as his disciples wept. But beneath the stoic facade lay a body in rebellion. First came the numbness creeping from his feet upward. Then, as the poison gripped his nervous system, his muscles began to fail, not with spasms but with a terrifying stillness. His last words, a reminder to repay a debt to Asclepius, hint at something modern toxicology confirms. Hemlock doesn't just kill, it paralyzes, leaving the mind agonizingly aware as the body shuts down. Athens' betrayal of its most famous thinker wasn't sudden. Years of political upheaval had left the city simmering with paranoia. Socrates' habit of questioning everything, from democracy to the gods, made him a target. His association with Alcibiades and Critias, 2 figures linked to violent oligarchic coups, painted him as a dangerous influence, but the trial itself was a farce. With no legal code to define impiety, the charges were vague enough to convict anyone who threatened the status quo. The jury's vote was close, suggesting even then that many Athenians regretted their choice. Modern science casts new light on Plato's account. Hemlock's active compound, coniine, disrupts communication between nerves and muscles, causing ascending paralysis. Victims remain conscious until respiratory failure, exactly as Socrates described. Yet some details don't align. Ancient texts mention a coldness spreading through his limbs, a symptom not typical of hemlock but possibly pointing to a mixed poison, or embellishment by Plato, who used the scene to immortalize his mentor's ideals. The real tragedy lies in what followed. Athens swiftly realized its mistake, executing the accusers and erecting a statue in Socrates' honor, but the damage was done. A city that prided itself on free thought had silenced its greatest mind, a warning echoing through history. When fear dictates justice, even the wisest aren't safe. Billy the Kid's death should have been the end of his legend. A clean bullet from Sheriff Pat Garrett's gun, fired in a darkened room at Fort Sumner on July 14, 1881. But from the moment the kid's body hit the floor, skepticism clung to the story like desert dust. The Lincoln County War, that bloody feud between rival cattle factions, had left New Mexico territory lawless and bitter. Garrett was deeply entangled in its politics, and the circumstances of the shooting, they're riddled with inconsistencies that make historians squint. Take the setting. Garrett claimed he ambushed the kid in Pete Maxwell's bedroom, catching him off guard in the dark. But witnesses, those who weren't conveniently loyal to Garrett, gave conflicting accounts. Some said the kid was armed and reaching for his pistol. Others insisted his hands were empty. Even the number of shots is disputed. Garrett's own story shifted over time, growing more dramatic with each retelling. And then there's the curious fact that no photographs of the corpse were released despite the kid's notoriety. In an era when post-mortem images of outlaws were a macabre public fascination, why was Billy's death so visually undocumented? The whispers started soon after. Maybe Garrett fabricated the whole thing. Maybe the kid slipped away, leaving some unlucky soul to be buried in his place. The theory gained traction when grave excavations in the 20th century turned up bizarre anomalies. 2 different graves in Fort Sumner have been claimed as the kid's, and neither tells a clear story. One held a skeleton with a bullet hole in the skull, but the body was too tall to match historical descriptions of the famously compact outlaw. The other, a jumble of bones with no definitive trauma. Modern science could have settled this, but DNA tests have only deepened the mystery. A 2005 exhumation attempt was blocked by locals, leaving researchers to rely on decades-old bone fragments of questionable provenance. The few tests conducted have been inconclusive, tangled in disputes over contamination and chain of custody. Even the facial reconstruction from one skull sparked debate. Some saw the kid's crooked grin, others just a generic cowboy. What if the truth isn't in the graves at all? Old letters surfaced in the 1950s, allegedly written by a man calling himself Brushy Bill Roberts, who claimed to be the real Billy the Kid. His knowledge of Lincoln County was eerily precise, down to intimate details only an insider would know. Skeptics dismissed him as a clever imposter, but his deathbed confession held a tantalizing detail. He described a secret deal with Garrett, a staged death to let both men walk away. Whether myth or manipulation, Billy's end reflects the chaos of the Wild West itself, a place where facts blurred and justice was often just a story told by the winner. Garrett became a legend, the lawman who tamed a killer. The kid became folklore, forever 21, forever escaping, and the bullet that supposedly ended it all. It might have been the first shot in a cover-up that's lasted a century and a half. The final year of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's life reads like a scene from one of his own operas. A crescendo of talent shadowed by paranoia, financial ruin, and a stranger whose arrival seemed to herald death itself. In the summer of 1791, an unknown messenger clad in grey appeared at the composer's door with an ominous commission, a requiem mass to be written in secret for a patron who refused to reveal his name. Mozart, already weakened by exhaustion and mounting debts, became convinced the stranger was a harbinger of his own demise. "I am composing this requiem for myself," he allegedly told his wife, Constance. Within months, he was dead at just 35, leaving the requiem unfinished and a trail of mysteries that still echo through history. The circumstances of his illness defy simple explanation. Contemporary accounts describe swollen limbs, violent fevers, and bouts of delirium so severe he imagined poison in his food. Some scholars point to trichinosis, contracted from undercooked pork, a theory supported by Mozart's own letter weeks before falling ill, where he raved about a meal of delicious cutlets. Others argue for rheumatic fever, citing the joint pain and rashes described by witnesses. But the whispers of foul play refused to fade. Antonio Salieri, Mozart's rival and court composer, long bore the brunt of suspicion. Fueled by rumors, he confessed to poisoning on his deathbed. While most historians dismiss this as myth, the tension between the two men was real. Salieri had connections to the same aristocratic circles that shunned Mozart, and their rivalry wasn't just professional, it was a clash between establishment favor and rebellious genius. Then there's the Requiem itself. The mysterious commissioner was later revealed to be Count Franz von Walsegg, an eccentric nobleman who frequently passed off others' work as his own. But the timing remains uncanny. Mozart, racing to complete the piece as his health failed, infused it with passages of haunting urgency like the Lacrimosa, a section he penned just days before collapsing. The manuscript bears his shaky handwriting, notes blurred as if written in a feverish rush. Was it merely coincidence, or did the Requiem's dark themes, judgment, mortality, become a self-fulfilling prophecy for the composer who felt death closing in? Even Mozart's burial feels suspiciously hurried. Records list his cause of death vaguely as heated military fever, a catch-all term that explained nothing. He was interred in a common grave with scant ceremony, a shocking fate for someone of his renown. Constans later claims that a storm prevented proper attendance have been debunked by weather records showing clear skies. The truth might be simpler and sadder. With Vienna's strict burial laws and the family's debts, a pauper's grave was all they could afford. What lingers isn't just the question of how Mozart died, but why his end feels so unresolved. The Requiem Commission, the rivalries, the gnawing sense of a life cut short, it's a symphony of unanswered questions. His genius burned too brightly to fade quietly, and perhaps that's why we keep searching for the final note he never got to write. The basement of the Ipatiev house smelled of gunpowder and confusion on the night of July 17, 1918. When the firing squad's bullets stopped echoing, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children lay in a heap, but the killers weren't done. In their panic, they discovered some of the Romanovs' corsets had been sewn with jewels, deflecting bullets and leaving survivors writhing in agony. Bayonets finished what bullets couldn't, turning the room into a scene of such butchery that even hardened revolutionaries reportedly gagged. Then came the real challenge, making 11 bodies disappear in a country on the brink of civil war. For decades, the Bolsheviks spun a web of half-truths. Official reports claimed only Nicholas had been executed, his family relocated to safety. But the grisly reality surfaced bit by bit, first with the discovery of a mass grave in 1979, then with DNA confirmation in the 1990s that matched bones to the royal family. Except there was an unsettling gap. 2 skeletons were missing. One was the heir, Alexei, the hemophiliac boy whose condition had driven Rasputin into the royal circle. The other, his youngest sister, Anastasia, whose rumored survival became a cottage industry of imposters. The most famous claimant, Anna Anderson, spent 60 years insisting she was Anastasia, even fooling some Romanov relatives with her knowledge of palace life. Dental records and later DNA exposed her as an opportunistic factory worker, but the myth endured. Then in 2007, archaeologists found a second grave nearby containing charred bone fragments of 2 teens. Advanced testing confirmed they were Alexei and one of his sisters, likely Anastasia or Maria. Yet even science couldn't kill the legend. Conspiracy theorists pointed to gaps in the evidence. Had some bones been deliberately destroyed? Why were the remains so fragmented? The darkest twist came from the killers themselves. Yakov Yurovsky, who oversaw the execution, left a chillingly detailed account. He described how acid and fire were used to mutilate the bodies before dumping them down a mine shaft, only to retrieve them days later when word leaked. The incompetence was staggering: bodies lost, evidence mishandled, lies unraveling. It wasn't just a regicide, it was a botched cover-up that fueled a century of speculation. What lingers isn't just the horror of that night, but the sheer clumsiness of the deception. The Romanovs' fate became a mirror for Russia itself, violence begetting chaos, truth buried under layers of myth. Even now, with most of the bones identified and the case officially closed, whispers persist. Because in that basement, more than lives were ended, an entire epoch was slaughtered, leaving behind scars that refused to fade. The River Ouse was bitter cold on March 28, 1941, when Virginia Woolf waded into its depths with stones heavy in her coat pockets. Her walking stick, left neatly on the bank, was the first clue, but her suicide note, addressed to her husband Leonard, was the key to understanding a mind collapsing under decades of invisible weight. What makes this moment so haunting isn't just the act itself, but the eloquence with which she described her unraveling. "I feel certain I am going mad again," she wrote, her words trembling with a lucidity that defied the chaos she feared. "I shan't recover this time." For a woman who had spent her life sculpting language to capture the human psyche, her final letter was her masterpiece of despair. Those stones tell their own silent story. Wolfe had attempted suicide before, once by overdose, another time by leaping from a window, but this method was chillingly deliberate. The pockets weighted with rocks weren't just practical, they were symbolic. Stones sink, stones silence, stones anchor you to the darkness. In her novels, water had always been a metaphor for both danger and transcendence. Think of the river in The Waves, or the drowning Ophelia she often referenced. Now she was stepping into her own metaphor, as if her art had predicted her end. Yet to reduce her death to madness alone misses the brutal reality of her struggle. Modern psychiatrists reviewing her symptoms, the hallucinations, the crushing lethargy, the periods of frenetic creativity followed by collapse, see clear markers of bipolar disorder, compounded by the trauma of sexual abuse in her youth and the constant terror of World War II's bombs shaking her home. Even Leonard, her steadfast protector, couldn't shield her this time. The Wolves had a pact: if the Germans invaded, they would take their own lives rather than face capture. Some scholars argue Virginia's suicide was a grim rehearsal for that scenario, a way to assert control when the world outside mirrored the chaos within. What lingers isn't just the tragedy, but the cruel irony. Wolfe's work revolutionized literature by giving voice to the inner lives of women, yet the very sensitivity that made her a genius also made survival unbearable. Her note's closing lines, "I don't think two people could have been happier than we have been," cuts deepest. Here was a woman who knew love, success, and artistic triumph, yet still found herself backing into the current. The stones pulled her under, but the real weight was the unrelenting storm inside her mind, a tempest no amount of brilliance could calm. Marilyn Monroe's bedroom was a tableau of tragedy when her housekeeper Eunice Murray found her sprawled across the bed just past midnight on August 5, 1962. Empty pill bottles littered the nightstand, Nembutal and chloral hydrate, a lethal cocktail for insomnia that had become the star's desperate nightly ritual. But the scene wasn't just grim, it was strangely staged. The phone, placed off the hook, suggested a last-minute cry for help. The position of her body, face down with one arm outstretched, contradicted Murray's claim she'd been neatly arranged. And then there was the missing red diary, a private journal Marilyn allegedly carried everywhere, filled with cryptic notes about her affairs with both John and Robert Kennedy. It vanished that night, never to surface again. The timeline of her final hours unravels under scrutiny. Around 8 p.m., Marilyn spoke to her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, sounding groggy but coherent. By 10:30, Murray insisted she checked on Marilyn and found the door locked, hearing only muffled sounds inside, yet waited 90 minutes before calling the doctor. When Greenson arrived, he didn't phone an ambulance. Instead, he broke in through a window, later claiming he found Marilyn already cold. First responders noted no rigor mortis, implying she'd died recently, but the coroner's report estimated death occurred around 9:30, creating a baffling 3-hour gap. Even the stomach contents told a conflicting story, packed with undigested pills, yet no water glass nearby to wash them down. Conspiracy theories swirl like smoke around the Kennedys' involvement. Weeks before her death, Marilyn had been desperately calling the White House, furious after Robert Kennedy allegedly cut ties with her. Peter Lawford, JFK's brother-in-law and Marilyn's close friend, later confessed to a chilling final call from her, slurring, "Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to Jack, say goodbye to yourself." Then the line went dead. Was it a suicide note spoken into the void, or had someone silenced her mid-sentence? Reports of a cleaning crew scrubbing the house before police arrived only deepened suspicions. The official verdict, probable suicide, has never satisfied skeptics. Toxicology showed enough barbiturates in her system to kill 10 people, yet Marilyn had no history of suicidal gestures, just accidental overdoses. The coroner found no pill residue in her stomach lining, suggesting injection, but needle marks were conspicuously absent. Even the mortician noticed anomalies, bruises on her hips and back, and discoloration around her mouth, possibly indicating forced ingestion. What really happened in that Brentwood cottage? A starlet overdosing in loneliness, or a pawn eliminated to protect powerful men? The Red Diary might hold the answer, but its absence speaks louder than any confession. Marilyn's death wasn't just an ending. It was the birth of a mystery that refuses to fade, as luminous and elusive as the woman herself. The motorcade rounded the corner onto Elm Street at 12:30 in the afternoon on November 22, 1963, and in the span of 6.9 seconds, the world changed forever. 3 shots rang out across Dealey Plaza. The first missed, the second struck President Kennedy in the upper back, exited his throat, then hit Governor Connolly in the back, wrist and thigh, a trajectory so improbable, critics would later dub it the magic bullet. The third shot was the kill shot, tearing through Kennedy's skull with such force that fragments of bone and brain matter sprayed onto the trunk of the limousine. But what should have been a straightforward investigation unraveled almost immediately into one of history's most debated crimes, a puzzle where every piece seemed to distort under scrutiny. The magic bullet theory hinges on a single copper-jacketed projectile, Commission Exhibit 399, found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. The Warren Commission insisted this one bullet caused 7 wounds in both men, a feat requiring it to zigzag midair, emerge nearly pristine, and defy basic physics. Ballistics experts remain divided. Some argue the bullet's slight bending aligns with hitting bone, while others point to the lack of deformation as proof it couldn't have done the damage described. Even Connolly himself, until his dying day, maintained he was hit by a separate shot. The real wrench in the theory, Kennedy's back wound was lower than the exit wound in his throat, implying the bullet traveled upward, yet Oswald's sniper's nest was above the motorcade. Did the bullet defy gravity, or was there a second shooter? Then there's the evidence that vanished. Kennedy's brain, the key to determining the bullet's trajectory, mysteriously disappeared after the autopsy. The official explanation that it was misplaced by the National Archives strains credulity. Even more damning, the House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded in 1979 that Kennedy's death was probably the result of a conspiracy, citing acoustic evidence of a 4th shot from the grassy knoll. That finding was later disputed, but the damage was done. The government itself had cast doubt on the lone gunman narrative, and just as the questions reached a fever pitch, the man who might have answered them was silenced. 2 days after the assassination, as millions watched live on television, nightclub owner Jack Ruby stepped out of a Dallas police basement crowd and fired a single bullet into Lee Harvey Oswald's abdomen. Oswald's dying words, "I'm just a patsy," became a rallying cry for conspiracy theorists. Ruby's motives were murky at best. He claimed he acted out of grief for Jackie Kennedy, yet phone records show he'd been calling mob associates in the days before the shooting. Was this a spontaneous act or a meticulously planned hit to ensure Oswald never spoke? The tragedy of JFK's assassination isn't just the loss of a president, it's the erosion of trust that followed. From the magic bullet to the missing brain, from Oswald's murder to the 88 witnesses who died suspiciously within 3 years, every thread leads to more questions. The official story asks us to accept a cascade of implausibilities. The alternative asks us to believe in a shadowy cabal powerful enough to orchestrate a coup in broad daylight. Which is harder to swallow? That may be the real mystery left standing in Dealey Plaza. Cleopatra's final act was meant to be as dramatic as her life, a queen choosing death over disgrace, clasping an asp to her breast as the ultimate symbol of defiance. At least, that's the version Plutarch immortalized, complete with the snake's fatal bite and her serene acceptance of fate. But peel back the layers of this ancient legend, and the story frays at the edges. For starters, an asp large enough to kill swiftly would have been nearly impossible to conceal, let alone maneuver into position without drawing attention. And then there's the timeline. Roman historians recorded Cleopatra's death as swift, yet asp venom induces a slow, agonizing paralysis. If not a snake, then what really ended the last pharaoh's life? Enter the poisoned comb theory. Recent toxicology research suggests Cleopatra may have used a hairpin or cosmetic tool laced with a lethal cocktail, perhaps hemlock mixed with opium, a blend that would mimic Plutarch's description of drowsiness followed by quiet death. This wasn't just a random guess. Cleopatra was a renowned scholar of poisons, rumored to have tested their effects on condemned prisoners. A concealed toxin would explain Octavian's frantic reaction. Upon discovering her body, he ordered an immediate search for puncture wounds, desperate to confirm suicide over assassination. Why the urgency? If Cleopatra had been murdered, it could spark rebellion among her loyal subjects. But if she'd cheated him of his triumph, parading her through Rome in chains, her death became a political problem. The lost tomb adds another layer of intrigue. Ancient sources claim Cleopatra and Antony were buried together in a lavish mausoleum near Alexandria, but not a single stone of it has been found. Octavian, now Augustus, likely ensured its location faded into obscurity. Allowing pilgrims to visit the lover's grave risked turning them into martyrs, a rallying point for dissent. Modern archaeologists have scoured Taposiris Magna, a temple complex linked to Cleopatra's cult, yet the chamber remains elusive. Some speculate the tomb lies underwater, submerged by earthquakes that reshaped Egypt's coastline centuries ago. What lingers isn't just the mystery of her death, but the brilliance of her last gamble. By controlling her end, Cleopatra denied Rome the satisfaction of conquest. The asp, real or symbolic, became her final weapon, a reminder that even in defeat she dictated the terms. And Octavian, he got his victory, but never the closure he wanted. The missing tomb, the conflicting accounts, even the whispers of a staged death, they all whisper the same truth. Cleopatra's greatest performance was her disappearance. Joan of Arc's trial wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a meticulously staged act of political theater, designed to break not just a girl, but the legend she'd become. Captured by Burgundian forces in 1430 and sold to the English for 10,000 livres, the 19-year-old warrior stood accused of heresy and witchcraft, charges that had less to do with divine law and everything to do with dismantling her symbolic power. The English needed her reputation destroyed because as long as Joan claimed divine guidance, she threatened their grip on France. Every question in that courtroom was a trap. When her judges demanded whether God hated the English, she replied with devastating simplicity, "Of his love or hatred I know nothing, but this I know, they will be driven out of France." The trial's transcripts reveal a chilling pattern of manipulation. Joan, who'd never been taught to read or write, was denied legal counsel and bombarded with theological jargon meant to twist her words. They fixated on her visions, her insistence on wearing men's clothing for protection. Even the voices of saints she swore guided her. Yet through 70 interrogations, she never wavered. When threatened with torture, she shot back, "Truly, if you were to tear me limb from limb, I would tell you nothing more." Her resilience only deepened their resolve. On May 30th, 1431, she was led to the stake in Rowan's marketplace, a mitre placed on her head labeling her a relapsed heretic. Witnesses described how the flames climbed, how she cried out for a crucifix to be held before her, and then the moment that birthed 1,000 legends. As the fire died down, her heart was found intact among the ashes. Whether fact or pious myth, that detail became a rallying cry. 25 years later, the church itself overturned her conviction in a posthumous retrial, declaring her innocent and a martyr. Witnesses came forward with damning revelations, how her judges had falsified evidence, how she'd been denied communion in her final hours, even how the executioner later confessed he'd greatly feared to be damned for burning a saint. The reversal was as political as the original verdict, a way for France to reclaim its heroine. But Joan's real vindication came centuries later, when science offered an eerie explanation for that unburned heart. Calcification can preserve cardiac tissue under extreme heat, creating a hardened shell, a phenomenon seen in modern cremations. Even in death, Joan defied expectations, leaving behind a mystery as enduring as her legacy. The girl who heard voices, who crowned a king and turned the tide of war, had one last miracle to offer, a heart that refused to turn to ash. Amelia Earhart's last transmission crackled through the radio static on July 2, 1937, a frantic message about running low on fuel and being unable to locate Howland Island. Then silence. The disappearance of the world's most famous aviator sparked an 80-year mystery that's fueled everything from scientific expeditions to wild conspiracy theories. But beneath the legend lies a trail of tantalizing clues, each one raising more questions than answers. Start with the navigation. Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, weren't just lost, they were victims of a perfect storm of errors. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca, stationed near Howland to guide them in, picked up their increasingly desperate calls, yet bizarrely, Earhart couldn't hear the ship's responses. Modern analysis suggests her radio's frequency settings were mismatched, rendering communication fatally one-sided. Even more damning, Noonan's celestial navigation, usually flawless, may have been thrown off by a simple miscalculation of their time zone. A single hour's mistake could have sent their Lockheed Electra dozens of miles off course, dooming them to vanish into the vast Pacific. That's where the bones come in. In 1940, British colonists on Gardner Island, now Nikumaroro, discovered a partial skeleton alongside a woman's shoe and a sextant box. The bones were dismissed at the time as male, but a 2017 re-examination using forensic imaging techniques told a different story. The arm bone's proportions matched Earhart's exactly, based on photos of her reaching into aircraft compartments. Even the shoe's size 9 fit her frame. Yet the real smoking gun was the location. Gardner lay directly along the flight path Earhart would have followed if her fuel calculations were off by just 1 hour. Then there are the radio signals. For days after her disappearance, amateur operators reported picking up distress calls from the Electra's frequency. One signal traced to Gardner Island contained a chilling phrase, "We have taken in water." The U.S. Navy dismissed these as hoaxes, but recent experiments prove otherwise. Researchers demonstrated that Earhart's plane, if landed intact on a reef, could have transmitted for days as tides submerged it, exactly the scenario described. But the darkest theory involves neither crash nor stranding. Rumors persist that Earhart and Noonan were captured by the Japanese, their plane downed near the Marshall Islands. A grainy photo recovered from Japanese archives shows a white woman and man on a dock, their faces hauntingly familiar. The U.S. government allegedly knew. Declassified documents reference a secret mission to recover Earhart's plane from Saipan in 1944. Even more unsettling, locals on Saipan still share oral histories of a famous female pilot executed there in a prisoner camp. The truth may lie scattered across the Pacific, in a bone fragment, a radio frequency, or a long-lost plane wreck. But Earhart's greatest legacy isn't just her flight, it's the way her disappearance mirrors the human obsession with the unknown. She didn't just vanish, she became a blank space on the map, waiting for someone to fill it in. Napoleon Bonaparte's final years on St. Helena were a slow, agonizing unraveling, a conqueror reduced to pacing the damp halls of Longwood House, his body betraying him in ways no enemy ever could. By the time of his death on May 5, 1821, the man who once ruled Europe was a shadow, swollen limbs, chronic pain, and bouts of vomiting so severe they left him bedridden for days. The official cause, stomach cancer, the same illness that claimed his father, but from the moment his body was laid to rest, whispers of something far more sinister began to spread. The arsenic theory took root decades later when modern analysis of Napoleon's hair samples revealed startlingly high levels of the poison. Some strands contained arsenic concentrations 38 times above normal, a smoking gun that seemed to point to murder. Proponents of this theory highlight the political motives. The British governor of St. Helena, Sir Hudson Lowe, had every reason to ensure Napoleon never returned to power. Even more damning, the wallpaper in Longwood House was laced with arsenic-based Scheele's green dye, a popular pigment at the time that released toxic vapors when damp. Could Napoleon have been slowly poisoned by his own surroundings without anyone lifting a finger? Yet the cancer evidence is equally compelling. Napoleon's autopsy, conducted by his personal physician, Dr. Francesco Antomacchi, described a stomach riddled with lesions, one so large it had fused to the liver. Family history weighed heavily. His father, 2 sisters, and brother all died of similar ailments. Modern pathologists reviewing the notes see textbook signs of advanced gastric cancer, exacerbated by the high-salt diet of preserved foods common on the isolated island. Even the arsenic readings aren't definitive. Hair analysis from the era often shows elevated levels due to widespread use in medicines, textiles, and even cosmetics. Then there's the bizarre footnote to Napoleon's death, the missing penis. During the autopsy, a Corsican priest reportedly severed the organ and gifted it to a Viennese doctor, beginning its strange journey through private collections. For nearly 2 centuries, it was displayed like a macabre trophy before finally being returned to Napoleon's descendants in 2016. More telling, though, was the state of his exhumed body when it was moved to Paris in 1840. Witnesses reported the emperor looked eerily preserved, his features recognizable after 19 years in the grave. Some attribute this to the lead lining of his coffin, others to the arsenic in his system acting as a preservative. Either way, it added another layer of myth to a death already shrouded in controversy. So was it poison or pathology? The truth might lie somewhere in between. Napoleon's final years were a perfect storm of neglect, stress, and environmental toxins, a slow assassination by circumstance rather than conspiracy. Even in death, he remained a prisoner of St. Helena, his legacy as contested as the contents of his stomach. The basement walls of the Ipatiev house still carried the scent of gunpowder when the executioners made their grim discovery. The Romanov sisters weren't dying as quickly as they'd expected. Bullets meant to kill cleanly had ricocheted off the layers of jewels sewn into the girls' corsets, a desperate last-minute precaution by their mother, Alexandra. 11-year-old Alexei, too weak from hemophilia to stand, had been carried down to the cellar and placed in a chair. His sisters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia clustered together as the firing squad leveled their weapons. The first volley dropped Nicholas instantly, but chaos erupted when the girls remained standing, their makeshift armor deflecting shots. In the panic that followed, bayonets and rifle butts became the weapons of choice, turning the room into a scene of unspeakable brutality. Decades later, science would expose the full horror of that night. The Bolsheviks initially claimed only Nicholas had been executed, insisting the family had been sent to safety. But in 1991, a shallow grave near Ekaterinburg yielded 9 skeletons, 5 matched to the Romanovs and their servants, while 2 of the children were missing. The mystery deepened when DNA analysis revealed the bones of Alexei and one sister weren't among them. Then in 2007, archaeologists uncovered a second burial site mere meters away. Fragmented remains of 2 more bodies lay beneath the soil, their condition suggesting a haphazard attempt to burn them with sulfuric acid. Mitochondrial DNA testing provided irrefutable proof. These were Alexei and likely Maria or Anastasia. The genetic signatures matched living relatives, including Prince Philip, whose grandmother had been Alexandra's sister, but the science couldn't silence the whispers. Some insisted Anastasia had survived, pointing to Anna Anderson's 60-year impersonation. Others noted the bizarre condition of the second grave, bones shattered as if by gunfire, yet no skulls intact enough to confirm identities beyond genetic material. Even the placement of the remains hinted at a cover-up. Why separate the bodies? Why hide some but not others? The answer may lie in the executioner's own panic. Yurovsky's later confession described how initial attempts to dissolve the corpses in acid failed, forcing his men to douse them in gasoline and burn what remained. The Romanovs, even in death, refused to vanish neatly. Perhaps the cruelest twist is how close they came to rescue. Just weeks before the massacre, a contingency of White Army forces had been advancing toward Ekaterinburg. Had the family been held just a little longer, or had the bullets found their mark cleanly, history might have remembered this night differently. Instead, the jewels meant to protect the sisters became a grotesque irony, prolonging their suffering without saving them. The DNA confirmed their identities, but the fractures in those bones tell another story, of a family not just killed but erased, their final moments as fragmented as the remains left behind. Caligula's final moments were as chaotic as his reign, a violent end fitting for an emperor who had spent 4 years terrorizing Rome with his whims. On January 24, 41 AD, as he left a theatrical performance in the palace's underground passage, the knives came out. Not from some lone assassin, but from his own inner circle. The plot had been brewing for months, fueled by senators and praetorian guards who could no longer stomach his tyranny. But what makes this assassination stand out isn't just the betrayal, it's the eerie aftermath that clung to the site like a curse. The attack itself was frenzied. Historical accounts describe at least 30 stab wounds, with one particularly brutal strike allegedly delivered by Cassius Chaerea, a high-ranking officer whom Caligula had mocked for his voice, dubbing him "little girl." As the blades plunged, the emperor reportedly gasped his final defiance, "I still live," a chilling echo of his delusions of divinity. The irony was bitter. This was the same man who had once declared himself a god, who built temples to his own glory, and now lay bleeding on the palace floor, his blood soaking into the very stones he'd walked upon with such arrogance. But death didn't bring peace. Almost immediately, eerie stories began circulating about the tunnels where Caligula fell. Actors performing plays in that same passage claimed to see shadows moving where none should be, or hear disembodied laughter echoing through the corridors. Some swore they felt an unseen presence shoving them mid-performance, an unsettling nod to Caligula's notorious love-hate relationship with the arts. He'd often forced senators to perform humiliating roles on stage, blurring the line between ruler and tormentor. Now it seemed the stage had claimed him too. The most macabre twist, the Senate's desperate attempt to erase him. They ordered his statues torn down, his name chiseled from monuments, even tried to annul his laws posthumously, as if they could undo the madness retroactively. Yet history refused to cooperate. Caligula's legacy lingered not just in records, but in the whispered superstitions of actors who avoided that passageway for generations. They called it the Emperor's Curse, a place where ambition and brutality had fused into something darker. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Caligula's death. The Senate's knives succeeded in killing the man, but the fear he instilled lived on, in the plays performed where he bled, in the stories passed down like warnings. His final words, "I still live," became a twisted prophecy, not as a god, not as a ruler, but as a specter haunting the very empire that had turned on him. The assassination was meant to be Rome's cleansing. Instead, it became its ghost story. The night sky over the Pacific Northwest was thick with rain on November 24, 1971, when a man calling himself D.B. Cooper handed a flight attendant a note that would become the stuff of legend. "I have a bomb," it read, and with those 4 words he set in motion one of the most audacious crimes in aviation history. His demands were cinematic: $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes delivered to the tarmac of Seattle-Tacoma Airport. What followed wasn't just a hijacking, it was a vanishing act so flawless it's taunted investigators for half a century. After releasing the passengers in exchange for the ransom, Cooper ordered the plane back into the stormy darkness. Somewhere over the rugged terrain of southwestern Washington, wearing nothing but a suit and loafers, he strapped on a parachute, lowered the rear stairs of the Boeing 727, and stepped into oblivion. The first tangible clue surfaced 9 years later in 1980, when a boy digging along the Columbia River unearthed 3 bundles of moldering $20 bills. The serial numbers matched the ransom money exactly, but the discovery only deepened the mystery. The bills were found miles north of Cooper's projected landing zone, suggesting either a failed jump or a deliberate misdirection. Even stranger, no fingerprints were lifted from the money, despite Cooper handling every bill during the hijacking. This wasn't just a dead end, it was a taunt, as if the skyjacker had anticipated every move investigators might make. Recent breakthroughs have brought tantalizing new leads and fresh frustrations. In 2016, a team analyzing the Thai Cooper left on the plane discovered trace amounts of rare earth metals, pointing to possible employment in the chemical or metallurgy industries. Then came the bombshell: a partial fingerprint lifted from the Thai's clip in 2018, matched against a military database. The hit led to a former Army paratrooper named Robert Rackstraw, whose skills aligned eerily with Cooper's parachute training, experience flying similar aircraft, even a criminal record for forgery. But just as the pieces seemed to fit, the FBI quietly closed the case in 2021, citing insufficient evidence. The enduring fascination with D.B. Cooper isn't just about the crime itself, it's about the defiance of it. In an era before hardened cockpit doors and biometric screening, one man exploited the system's weaknesses with chilling precision. He didn't just disappear, he left behind a blueprint for the perfect mystery, daring us to solve it. The ransom money, the cryptic clues, even the way he ordered a bourbon and soda minutes before jumping every detail feels ripped from a spy novel. Yet the most haunting question remains: did Cooper survive that freezing leap into the unknown, or did the wilderness swallow him whole? Until someone finds that second parachute or a body, the sky will keep its secret. Emperor Nero's final hours were a far cry from the grandeur he'd spent his life cultivating. Cornered in a villa outside Rome, with the Senate's death sentence looming and rebellion spreading through the streets, history's most infamous ruler faced an impossible choice. According to the historian Suetonius, Nero hesitated, pacing with a dagger in hand, muttering, "What an artist dies in me," a phrase that's since become shorthand for his unchecked ego. But beneath the theatricality lay a man paralyzed by fear. When the sound of approaching horsemen reached his ears, he finally pressed the blade to his throat, but his hand shook so violently that his secretary had to guide the fatal stab. Even in death, Nero couldn't escape spectacle. His last words weren't just a lament, they were a performance, a final act of self-mythologizing for an audience that had long since turned against him. The myth of Nero fiddling while Rome burned is one of history's most enduring and misleading images. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD did reduce 2/3 of the city to ashes, and Nero's response was undeniably bizarre. Ancient sources like Tacitus describe him singing about the fall of Troy from a private stage as the flames spread, but the fiddle, that's pure fabrication. The instrument didn't even exist in ancient Rome. The story likely sprouted from a mix of political smear campaigns and creative retellings over centuries. Nero wasn't plucking strings while his empire crumbled, but he wasn't entirely blameless either. rumors swirled that he'd ordered the fire to clear land for his opulent Domus Aurea palace complex. While modern historians doubt he was the arsonist, his decision to seize scorched districts for his own projects fueled public rage. The fire became the catalyst for Nero's unraveling. In a desperate bid to deflect blame, he scapegoated Rome's Christian community, subjecting them to horrific executions that backfired spectacularly. By 68 AD, the provinces were in open revolt. His once loyal Praetorian Guard abandoned him, and the Senate declared him a public enemy. The reality of Nero's downfall is darker than any legend. This wasn't just the end of a tyrant, it was the implosion of a man who'd conflated art with rule, treating an empire as his personal stage. The fire, the persecutions, even his botched suicide, they all reflect a ruler who couldn't distinguish between governance and theater. And in that fatal blurring of lines, Nero ensured his legacy would be less about what he accomplished and more about the myths he couldn't control. Bruce Lee's death should have been impossible. The man who redefined physical prowess, whose lightning-fast strikes became the stuff of legend, was just 32 years old when he collapsed in his Hong Kong apartment on July 20, 1973. The official cause, cerebral edema, a swelling of the brain so sudden and severe it defied logic. How could someone in peak condition, a martial artist who treated his body like a finely tuned instrument, succumb to something so inexplicable? The answer might lie in a bottle of prescription painkillers found near his body. Equagic, a blend of aspirin and the tranquilizer meprobamate, was later cited as a potential trigger, with some experts suggesting Lee had an undiagnosed hypersensitivity to the drug. But the whispers started almost immediately. Was this really an accident or something darker? The so-called Lee family curse gained traction when his son, Brandon, met an eerily similar fate 20 years later. On the set of The Crow in 1993, a prop gun meant to fire blanks discharged a fragment of real bullet, striking Brandon in the abdomen. He bled out just hours before he was set to marry his fiancée. The parallels were too chilling to ignore, both deaths abrupt, both shrouded in bizarre circumstances, both cutting short lives brimming with potential. Superstitious narratives flourished, pointing to everything from a vengeful spirit angered by Bruce's Game of Death film, where he literally fought his way out of a coffin, to a generational hex. Rational explanations existed, of course. The film industry's lax safety protocols in Brandon's case, or the dangerous cocktail of stress, exhaustion, and medication in Bruce's. But grief rarely bows to logic. Then there's the enigma of Bruce's final day. Witnesses reported he'd complained of a headache hours before his collapse, yet he'd been in good spirits discussing future projects with colleagues. The autopsy revealed no alcohol or illegal drugs in his system, only traces of cannabis, hardly enough to explain a fatal brain hemorrhage. A fringe theory emerged decades later. Could repeated strikes to the head during training have caused chronic swelling that finally reached a tipping point? Neurologists remain divided. What's undeniable is the timing. Bruce had just signed a contract with Warner Bros., poised to become the first global Asian action star. His death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a cultural reset, leaving fans to wonder what might have been if fate or something else hadn't intervened. The most haunting detail, though, isn't the medical mystery or the curse rumors, it's the unfinished legacy. Bruce's handwritten notes for Game of Death outlined a philosophy far beyond martial arts, a treatise on adaptability, on bending like water. He never got to fully articulate it. Brandon's death, meanwhile, froze The Crow in cinematic limbo, a film forever shadowed by real-life mortality. 2 generations of Lees, 2 careers cut short at the brink of transcendence. Coincidence, perhaps, but in the space between accident and destiny, the questions linger like an unbroken silence after a battle cry. The morning of June 28, 1914, was supposed to be the end of Gavrilo Princip's mission before it even began. The young Bosnian Serb nationalist stood among the crowd in Sarajevo, clutching a bomb as Archduke Franz Ferdinand's motorcade rolled past, but when his moment came, nerves got the better of him. He fumbled the fuse, hurled the explosive too late. It bounced off the convertible's folded roof and detonated under the next car, injuring officers and bystanders. The Archduke, unharmed but shaken, brushed off the chaos with eerie calm, insisting the day's events proceed as scheduled. Princip, convinced he'd failed, vanished into the crowd, certain his chance had slipped away. What happened next was a cascade of absurdities that tilted the world toward war. After a tense reception at Sarajevo's town hall, Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded from the bombing at the hospital. No one told the driver. As the motorcade sped toward its original route, confusion erupted. The driver took a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street, a dead-end alley where, by sheer coincidence, Princip sat nursing his failure at a cafe. Some accounts claim he'd stepped out to buy a sandwich, others that he was drowning his sorrows in a coffee. Either way, history hinged on that momentary pause. When the Archduke's car stalled while attempting to reverse, Princip found himself staring at his target from barely 5 feet away. This time, he didn't hesitate. 2 shots rang out, one piercing Ferdinand's jugular, the other striking his wife Sophie in the abdomen. The aftermath was as surreal as the assassination itself. Sophie died almost instantly, slumping into her husband's lap. Ferdinand, bleeding profusely, kept repeating, "It's nothing," before collapsing. The car raced toward the governor's residence, but it was too late. By 3:30 that afternoon, both were dead. Princip, swallowing cyanide in a botched suicide attempt, was seized by the crowd. The vial was old, it only made him vomit. But here's the chilling detail often overlooked. This wasn't just luck or lone wolf terrorism. Princip was part of a 6-man cell armed by the Black Hand, a shadowy Serbian nationalist group. Every failure that day, the botched bomb, the wrong turn, even the Archduke's stubborn insistence on continuing his visit, was a domino falling toward catastrophe. The sandwich stop wasn't just a twist of fate, it was the universe aligning for disaster. Within weeks, Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia would drag Europe into the war that slaughtered millions. And it all traced back to a stalled car, a missed turn, and a gunman who got hungry at exactly the wrong moment. The last time anyone saw Glenn Miller alive, he was climbing into a single-engine plane on a foggy December afternoon in 1944, vanishing into the gloom over the English Channel like a fading trumpet note. America's most famous bandleader had spent World War II boosting Allied morale, his swing music crackling through radios from London to Berlin, but his final flight wasn't part of the tour. Miller was bound for Paris, where his orchestra was scheduled to perform for troops liberated from the Nazis. He never made it. The wreckage of the plane was never found. No distress call was ever heard. It was as if the man who'd penned Moonlight Serenade had simply dissolved into the mist. Theories about that flight spiral like one of Miller's big band arrangements. Official records blame bad weather. The Norseman aircraft wasn't built for icy conditions, and the channel was notorious for sudden squalls, but whispers of sabotage took root almost immediately. Some claimed Miller was carrying sensitive documents. His plane accidentally shot down by friendly fire during a botched rendezvous. Others pointed to the eerie coincidence that several musicians in his unit died under mysterious circumstances around the same time. Then there's the most haunting possibility, that Miller survived the crash only to perish in a German POW camp. A 1945 intelligence report surfaced decades later, citing an SS officer who claimed to have interrogated a captured American matching Miller's description. The story was never verified. 40 years later, a fisherman trawling the channel snagged something unexpected, an aircraft engine entangled in his nets. Experts identified it as coming from a Norseman, the same model Miller flew. But when divers searched the area, they found no fuselage, no personal effects, not even a shred of clothing. The engine alone couldn't confirm Miller's fate, only deepen the mystery. Why was it so far off course? Had the plane broken apart midair, scattering debris across miles of ocean? Or was this another dead end in a decades-long puzzle? Perhaps the most chilling artifact isn't wreckage but sound. Days before his disappearance, Miller's orchestra recorded a session for the BBC. The final track, Peggy the Pin-Up Girl, crackles with an uncanny energy. Miller's musicians playing with an almost desperate intensity, as if they sensed time running out. When the last note fades, there's a pause before the engineer's voice cuts in. "That's it, gentlemen, that's all. The recording survives, the band does not." Within a year, many of those players would perish in another plane crash, this one in France. Miller's legacy endures in the gaps: the unscheduled flight, the missing wreckage, the music left unfinished. He wasn't just a casualty of war, he became its ghost, a melody cut off mid-phrase, leaving the world to wonder how the song was supposed to end. Anne Boleyn stepped onto the scaffold at the Tower of London on the morning of May 19, 1536, clutching a prayer book with hands that refused to tremble. She'd specifically requested an executioner from Calais, a swordsman, not the crude axe reserved for common traitors. Henry Roman VIII, in one of his last cruel acts of twisted mercy, had agreed. The French swordsman's blade was sharper, his technique cleaner, but it was still a calculated humiliation. A Queen of England reduced to kneeling like a criminal before a hired foreign hand. Yet what happened next wasn't just an execution, it was a performance that would echo through history. Her final speech, delivered with unsettling composure, struck a delicate balance between defiance and diplomacy. "Good Christian people," she began, her voice steady despite the scaffold's ominous shadow, "I am come hither to die according to law." She never admitted guilt to the charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Charges so ludicrous even contemporaries whispered about their absurdity. Instead, she praised Henry as a good and gentle prince, a choice some historians interpret as subtle irony. With no confession, no breakdown, and certainly no plea for mercy, Anne denied her accusers the satisfaction of watching her crumble. Then came the moment that still sends shivers down spines. As she knelt, her ladies removed her French hood, freeing her dark hair. Instinctively, she reached up to tuck it behind her ears, not out of vanity, but to expose her neck for the blade. It was the last gesture of control she would ever have, but the story doesn't end with the sword swing. The Tower of London, already steeped in centuries of bloodshed, gained a new restless spirit. Guards and visitors alike have reported glimpses of a figure in a flowing Tudor gown near the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Anne's body was hastily buried in an arrow chest. Some claim to hear whispered prayers in the dead of night, others catch the scent of lavender, her favorite fragrance, near the scaffold site. The most chilling account comes from a 19th century sentry who swore he saw a procession of spectral figures carrying a headless body across Tower Green. He was found unconscious at his post, his rifle bent at an impossible angle. What makes Anne's ghost different from the Tower's other phantoms is the persistence of her appearances. Unlike the fleeting shadows of the princes in the Tower or the silent spectre of Lady Jane Grey, Anne's presence feels deliberate. She's been spotted gazing from windows, gliding along battlements, even standing among tour groups, a woman in period dress who vanishes when approached. Paranormal researchers point to the sheer injustice of her death as the fuel for this unrest. Anne wasn't just executed, she was erased. Portraits were destroyed, her initials scraped from palace walls, even her coronation banquet records burned. Yet in trying to obliterate her, Henry ensured she would haunt him forever, not as a disgraced queen, but as a woman who met her end with a dignity that outshone his pettiness. Perhaps the most haunting detail isn't the ghost stories, but the fate of that Calais swordsman. History doesn't record his name, only that he was paid £24 for his services, the price of a clean cut. In the end, even Henry's attempt to strip Anne of her royalty backfired. The sword, meant to degrade her, became part of her legend, A queen died that day, but a martyr and a mystery was born. King George V's final hours were not just a private tragedy. They became a carefully orchestrated public spectacle, with death itself scheduled for the next day's headlines. On the evening of January 20th, 1936, the king lay gasping at Sandringham House, his lungs ravaged by chronic bronchitis. His physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, made a cold calculation. The monarch's agony would likely drag through the night, denying newspapers the tidy, death at midnight narrative they'd prepared. So Dawson did the unthinkable. At 11 o'clock, he injected a lethal cocktail of morphine and cocaine directly into the king's jugular vein. The royal heartbeat ceased 25 minutes later, just in time for the Times morning edition. Dawson's secret diary, unearthed decades later, laid bare the chilling rationale. It was evident the last stage might endure for many hours, he wrote, unnecessary to the patient but detrimental to the nation's morale. This wasn't mercy, it was media manipulation disguised as compassion. The British public would wake to orderly headlines announcing their king's peaceful passing, unaware that his final breath had been stolen for the sake of optics. Even the official bulletin was doctored, backdated to create the illusion of a midnight death. The perfect royal exit required a lie, but the ethical firestorm goes deeper than one doctor's decision. The palace had long treated the monarchy as a performance, with illness and death scripted like a courtly play. George himself had once quipped, "Bugger Bogner." When told the seaside heir might extend his life, his disdain for prolonged suffering clear. Yet the public facade mattered more. Imagine the scandal if newspapers had to retract their pre-written obituaries, or if the king's demise bled into the less prestigious afternoon editions. Dawson's syringe guaranteed a clean narrative arc: sunset, death knell, dawn of a new reign. Modern medicine recoils at Dawson's actions, yet the shadow of his choice lingers. Was this euthanasia or murder, a kindness or a betrayal? The king's grandchildren remain divided. While some historians argue George was already beyond saving, others note his son Prince Albert's frantic midnight dash to Sandringham too late to say goodbye thanks to Dawson's timetable. Even the cocaine in the fatal dose raises eyebrows. Far from a standard sedative, it may have been included to ensure the king's final facial expressions remained serene for the deathbed photographers waiting in the wings. The bitterest irony, George's timely death robbed him of one last dignity. His devoted wife, Queen Mary, had promised to stay by his side until the end. But exhausted from weeks of vigil, she retired to her rooms at 10:45 precisely when Dawson prepared his syringe. The king died alone, his queen asleep down the hall, his final moments traded for a newspaper's deadline. History remembers the dignified headlines, not the hurried betrayal behind them, and that, perhaps, was the point all along. The bunker beneath Berlin was thick with smoke and panic in those final hours of April 30th, 1945. When Soviet troops finally breached the Reich Chancellery days later, they didn't find Adolf Hitler defiantly clutching a rifle. They found a shattered skull fragment and a set of teeth. The official story, shaped by Soviet intelligence and later echoed by Western allies, was clear. Hitler had bitten into a cyanide capsule while simultaneously shooting himself in the temple for good measure. Eva Braun, his newlywed wife of barely 40 hours, died beside him after ingesting cyanide, her body eerily intact compared to the gruesome scene left by Hitler's gunshot. But the truth, as always in history's darkest corners, is far messier than the tidy narrative handed down for decades. Take that skull fragment, long touted as irrefutable proof of Hitler's death. For years, it sat in Soviet archives, a macabre trophy of war. But when American researchers finally gained access in 2009, DNA testing revealed a bombshell. The bone belonged to a woman under 40, impossible for Hitler, who was 56 at death. The Soviets had either misidentified the remains or deliberately planted false evidence to seed confusion. Even the teeth tell a conflicting story. Dental records matched Hitler's, but forensic anthropologists later noted the reconstruction could have been manipulated, citing oddities like mismatched fillings that didn't align with his known dental work. Then there's Eva Braun's cyanide. While her cause of death was never seriously disputed, the logistics raise eyebrows. Witnesses described her corpse as strikingly peaceful, hands folded neatly in her lap, a stark contrast to the violent spasms typically caused by cyanide poisoning. Some toxicologists speculate she may have taken a different compound, like the fast-acting L pill, issued to high-ranking Nazis designed to kill painlessly. Others wonder if the serene pose was staged. Soviet autopsy photos show suspicious signs of possible post-mortem rearrangement, as if someone had tidied the scene before the cameras arrived. But the most unsettling chapter came after the bodies were burned. Hitler's remains weren't quietly buried, they became pawns in a decades-long game of Soviet disinformation. Initially interred at a Red Army base in Magdeburg, they were exhumed in 1970 by the KGB, cremated, and secretly scattered in a river. Why the secrecy? Declassified documents suggest the Soviets feared creating a neo-Nazi pilgrimage site, but the constant shuffling of remains also allowed them to control the narrative. At one point, Stalin himself allegedly kept a piece of Hitler's jawbone in his desk, a twisted memento of his defeated rival. The bunker's darkest secret isn't just how Hitler died, but how his death was weaponized. By obscuring the details, the Soviets fed conspiracy theories that Hitler had escaped to Argentina or Antarctica, myths that persist today. In reality, the fragments left behind paint a picture of a man terrified of capture, desperately erasing himself from history. But even in that, he failed. The very confusion surrounding his death ensured he'd haunt the 20th century like no other tyrant, his final moments as contested as his legacy. The neon glow of the Las Vegas Strip had barely faded into September 7, 1996, when the black BMW carrying Tupac Shakur pulled up to a red light at Flamingo Road. What happened next wasn't just a drive-by shooting. It was a burst of chaos so rapid, so shrouded in contradictions, that even witnesses couldn't agree on how many gunmen opened fire. 14 shots rang out, shattering glass and flesh as the passenger side of the car was raked with bullets. Tupac, already wounded in a previous attack, took multiple rounds to the chest and thigh. His record label boss, Suge Knight, suffered only a graze to the head, a disparity that would later fuel conspiracy theories. The car sped toward the hospital, but the damage was done. 6 days later, Tupac was gone at 25, leaving behind a crime scene as murky as the lyrics that made him famous. Theories about who pulled the trigger spiral like a hip-hop whodunit. For years, the prime suspect was Orlando "Baby Lane" Anderson, a Crips member Tupac and Suge had attacked hours earlier at the MGM Grand after spotting him in the lobby. Security footage showed the brutal beatdown, but crucially, no cameras captured the shooting itself. Vegas PD's explanation: the intersection surveillance system was mysteriously under maintenance that night. Even Anderson's alibi crumbled under scrutiny. Though he denied involvement, he was murdered in an unrelated gang shooting just 2 years later, taking any possible confession to the grave. But the darkest twist came in 2018 when a podcast interview with a retired LAPD detective named Greg Kading dropped a bombshell. According to Kading, a high-ranking Bloods member named Dwayne Keefe D. Davis confessed on tape to being in the car that night, implicating Anderson as the shooter. "I was the only one old enough to talk," Davis allegedly said, referring to his immunity deal with authorities. Yet despite the explosive claim, no charges were ever filed. The missing footage isn't the only gap in the case. Tupac's own entourage that night raises eyebrows. Of the 4 cars in their convoy, only Suge's BMW was targeted, an eerie precision suggesting inside knowledge. Then there's Suge himself, whose erratic behavior post-shooting included refusing to cooperate with police and later serving prison time for an unrelated manslaughter charge. Some theorists point to the East Coast-West Coast rap feud, speculating Tupac's death was payback for his public taunts against Biggie and Bad Boy Records. Others whisper about deeper industry vendettas, citing Tupac's growing political activism and plans to launch a black empowerment label. Even the autopsy holds inconsistencies. Though officially declared dead from respiratory failure, rumors persist that Tupac's body showed signs of trauma inconsistent with just gunshot wounds. What makes Tupac's murder endure isn't just the unsolved questions, it's the way his death mirrored the violent duality of his art. A poet who chronicled street life yet dreamed of revolution, Tupac became a martyr to the very forces he rapped about. The security tapes that vanished, the confessions that led nowhere, the eerie timing just 11 months before Biggie met a similar fate, all weave a tapestry of suspicion. In the end, Tupac's story didn't conclude with a verdict. It dissolved into myth, a cautionary tale where the truth might be too dangerous to ever fully surface. History's greatest mysteries share a haunting symmetry. The more power someone wields, the more their death becomes a battleground of lies, betrayals, and unanswered whispers. From Alexander the Great's poisoned cup to Tupac's shadowy drive-by, these stories aren't just about how lives ended, but how truth gets buried under layers of political maneuvering, personal vendettas, and the relentless march of time. Notice the patterns: a Romanov jewel deflecting bullets only to prolong suffering, Nero's staged suicide timed for headlines, Marie Antoinette's hair whitening overnight from the weight of a nation's hatred. Power doesn't just corrupt, it twists the very narratives of death, leaving us to sift through the wreckage for fragments of what really happened. Yet the most chilling thread isn't the violence, it's the silencing. Missing diaries like Marilyn's red notebook, Hatshepsut's chiseled-off monuments, Rasputin's classified MI6 files. Each erasure begs the same question: who benefits from the gaps? Sometimes it's rivals covering their tracks, other times regimes rewriting history, but always, it's a reminder that the stories we inherit are often the ones someone chose not to burn. Even science, with its DNA tests and spectral analysis, can only crack open doors to rooms long since emptied of proof. So which mystery lingers in your mind? The poetic injustice of Socrates sipping hemlock for the crime of asking questions? Amelia Earhart's radio crackling across an empty ocean? Or perhaps poor Anastasia, her fate swinging between a bullet and a fairy tale? The comments are yours. Tell me which historical death leaves you staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m., chasing answers that slip like smoke. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's darkest corners, hit that subscribe button, because the past isn't done whispering its secrets, not by a long shot.